Hello and welcome. You're watching an NDTV exclusive. As the world struggles to make sense of Vladimir Putin's unprovoked act of aggression against Ukraine, one man might offer an insight into a dark chapter in American politics that may have acted as a precursor to the Russian invasion. My guest today is former U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton. Now, just to recap, John Bolton was National Security Advisor during what became Donald Trump's Ukraine Gate. In 2019, then President Trump had delayed U.S. military aid to Ukraine while he pressured Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy for damaging material on his then presidential candidate rival Joe Biden. Particularly, Trump was interested in information on millions of dollars of supposedly dodgy investments that have been made in Ukraine by Joe Biden's son Hunter. One of the reasons John Bolton is said to have quit as NSA. And John Bolton joins me on NDTV. Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador Bolton, for having you. Now, obviously, the big question in everyone's mind is how all those bizarre events way back in 2019 may have impacted what we're seeing now. But for the benefit particularly of our Indian viewers who may not be aware of what exactly went down, take us through some of that extraordinary process that we saw, which you were witness to, of Trump literally saying he will not pass on the aid until Zelenskyy gives him dirt on Biden.
Right. Well, thank you very much for having me. You know, the support for Ukraine's defense, for its independence and territorial integrity in the U.S. Congress is very, very strong, really bipartisan at a time in the U.S. when bipartisanship is hard to find. So Congress, as part of the regular budget process, had appropriated substantial amounts of money for security assistance for Ukraine in different accounts. It's complicated, but in particular, $250 million that would have been supplied and that needed to be obligated before the end of September of 2019, September 30, when the American government's fiscal year ends. Trump found out about this money, and given all he was hearing from Rudy Giuliani and other supporters of his about Hillary Clinton's missing computer server that had been used against him in the 2016 election, about Hunter Biden, as you say, and his income from Ukraine, he suddenly realized that he could use this $250 million as leverage to get some of these things from President Zelenskyy. Now, this was a misuse of governmental power for personal political perspectives, but that never slowed Trump down. And what happened was, and is demonstrated in what he called the famous perfect phone call between him and Zelenskyy, Trump was trying to leverage help from the Ukraine government to assist Trump's political campaign in this country. And it was a huge struggle. All of Trump's advisors, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, myself, were in favor of providing Ukraine with this security assistance, which they desperately needed. And ultimately it was provided before that end of the fiscal year crisis would have hit. But this conversation between Trump and Zelenskyy and the entire circumstances, which are much lengthier and more complicated than we can get into, prevented Zelenskyy from getting a good personal relationship with the president. It put Ukraine right in the center of American presidential politics, which is never a good place to be. And it, for the entire length of the campaign, which in America takes forever now, but from basically the middle of 2019 through the end of 2020, through the end of Trump's term, Zelenskyy couldn't make progress on the bilateral relationship. And I do think that had a significant effect in making it harder for the U.S. to understand the threat that Ukraine faced and perhaps the steps that could have been taken to avert this terrible war we're seeing now.
That's what I was coming to, because, given that this whole business of quid pro quo was being pushed by a sitting U.S. president, do you think that somewhere along the line that emboldened Putin in what he's done today?
Yes, I don't think there's any question about it. I don't know that it was the most important factor, but it was certainly a factor. I think in conversations with Putin, Trump didn't convey respect for Zelenskyy. I think Putin could easily have picked that up. and Putin could see that Trump had no interest in or appreciation of the geopolitical realities that Ukraine faced and that could endanger NATO members like Poland. Even though Ukraine is not a member of NATO, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the Baltic republics, obviously, and other Eastern European countries are. So I think Putin could see that he had an advantage here. He was wise enough, from his perspective, not to do something in the middle of an American presidential election where he couldn't predict the results. But I think he felt that if Trump won re-election, he would have 4 years to be able to exploit what he had learned about Ukraine.
Right. And do you think that the delay in military aid to Ukraine has impacted its ability to defend itself against Russia?
Well, I think that particular delay was only a matter of a couple months, but I do think that there was not an appreciation broadly in NATO, that's for sure, but not broadly enough in the United States about the amount of work that had to be done to upgrade the Ukrainian military and the nature of the threat that they would face from Russia a lot sooner than people predicted.
Right. You know, it's fascinating to hear you say all of this because, as you're well aware, even more than us in India, that there's this bizarre debate playing out in America where there are a bunch of people, particularly on the right, saying that this actually shows you that Trump was not, in fact, Putin's puppet, that Putin, did not invade Ukraine or carry out any of this when Trump was in office, but he did it once Trump left office. To that you would say what?
I think that's totally ridiculous. I realize you're not saying it. You're repeating what some people in this country have said, but it's totally ridiculous. I think if Trump had been reelected, the Russians would have been in Kyiv already. Trump barely knew where Ukraine was on a map. He once asked John Kelly, who was chief of staff at the time, if Finland was a part of Russia. And as with essentially every important decision that Trump made in his presidency, it all revolved around the fundamental issue: does this benefit Donald Trump? It was not on the basis of philosophy or policy or geostrategic reasoning about Ukraine and NATO and Russia. It was all about Donald Trump.
Right. And again, just to recap, Ambassador, you were there as NSA. You were fighting hard to get Trump and his aides not to do this, and then finally you had to walk out.
Well, as it happened, there were a lot of other things coming together at the same time, and I resigned on September the 10th of 2019. But I knew by that point that pressure from Congress, among other things, meant that Trump would authorize the security assistance to Ukraine before it disappeared on September the 30th. And in fact, I think it was actually released on September the 11th, the day after I left. So I felt that part had been taken care of, but it was obvious that this was just the beginning of the problem and that the relationship with Ukraine was very much in peril because Trump didn't understand it other than as it affected his political fortunes.
Right. But coming to where we are today, given the fact that Putin has not just invaded, but every day we see an escalation, today there was an attack on a nuclear power plant. How seriously do you think that the world, America, should be taking Putin's nuclear threats? Is this empty bluster, or should we all be worried?
Yeah, I think the threat is mostly a bluff. I think anytime a nuclear power talks about changing the alert status of its weapons, you have to take it seriously. But from what we can see publicly, there's no physical evidence that anything has changed in Russia. I think Putin was trying to intimidate timid Western leaders. But I do think we have to look at Ukraine in the broader global perspective and to appreciate the entente, to use an old French word, between Russia and China that's grown up. I think China has Russia's back in the Ukraine crisis, but I think Russia would have China's back if a similar kind of crisis developed, for example, with Taiwan or in the South China Sea or anywhere along China's land border. This is something new. We haven't seen this kind of get together by Russia and China for many years, not since Cold War days. Ironically, of course, China will be the senior partner in this entente. But what Putin does to weaken NATO and Europe not only strengthens Russia, but strengthens China as well. So it is a grave threat in the big picture over the long term. There's no doubt about it.
Ambassador, is it also the case that Putin is taking advantage of the fact that the other big global superpower, America, is a house divided, that in addition to the bickering that we were talking about between different sections of the political fraternity there, or who could have done a better job, you actually have people like Trump and others praising Putin. I believe Trump even called Putin a genius.
Right. Well, I can only say on that score that within the past few days, Trump has actually said that the situation in Ukraine is a disaster and needs to stop. And he basically was saying, if I were in power, I would find a way to negotiate with Putin and resolve this. So Trump's position, as on so many things, depends on what time of the day you ask him about it. Actually, I think America is more united in support of Ukraine. There's certainly disagreements about how effective the Biden administration has been, and it was ineffective enough that the deterrence efforts it made didn't stop Putin. But the criticism of Russia is near universal, and really those who are saying Ukraine shouldn't matter to the United States are a pretty tiny minority.
Right. But to this point that Trump keeps making, that if he was in office, he would have handled it differently. What would he have done if he was in office? Since you were there, so you had an idea.
Of course, well, you never know with Trump is the short answer to your question. But I don't think he cared about Ukraine. I don't think he understood it. I don't think he saw value in it,
right,
except to the extent it impacted his political future. And I think he would not have done what was necessary to prevent this invasion. I think it might have occurred earlier.
Right. In fact, as you said, if it was him, Putin may already be in Kyiv. But just in conclusion, though, Ambassador, the wider point that many have been making in this time is that while it's one thing for America to take the high moral ground on Russian aggression, does America really have that platform, given America's own history of invasions in what are called quote-unquote dirty wars, whether it's in the Middle East or beyond?
Well, I think the circumstances are really very different. This is a totally unprovoked war against Ukraine. Conflicts the U.S. has been in have typically been in self-defense or in support of a friend or ally who's been attacked. And our allies threatened. So I don't accept the idea of moral equivalence with what Putin is doing in Ukraine at all. I think the circumstances really between what this authoritarian regime in Moscow is doing and what the U.S. has done are really worlds apart.
Right. You'd say that despite all those questions that emerged after the Gulf Wars, particularly where again there was no clear evidence of the smoking gun, America still went ahead and invaded, a huge loss of lives, devastation?
Well, I think the objective of the invasion, which was to prevent Saddam Hussein from conducting aggression against his neighbors, as he had done against Kuwait in 1990, and as he threatened to do against others, was completely justified. And it wasn't for the U.S. to gain territory, which is in part what Putin is doing here. It certainly wasn't even to get favorable terms on oil purchases from Iraq. It was to try and give the Iraqi people a chance to run their own government. It succeeded in its most important mission, which was overthrowing Saddam Hussein, and has not succeeded in its larger hopes and aspirations for the Iraqi people,
right,
sadly because of the influence of Iran and to the detriment of the Iraqi people.
Right. And finally, Ambassador, what do you see as the end game here? Because there seems to be no clear path out of this particular war. Putin is escalating. Peace talks seem distant. Let me just try and ask you, I guess in simple terms, what's the kind of best case scenario and what's a worst case scenario?
Well, the best case scenario is if the West and others put stricter sanctions on, drove a stake through the heart of the Russian energy sector and brought Putin to his senses. I think that's remote possibility. The more likely possibility is Putin grinds grinds Ukraine into the ground, and with large loss of life and devastation and a pretty grim outcome, but with Russia ultimately the military victor.
If I have time, just a last question. America, NATO so far has said they're not getting involved in the fight, despite multiple requests from Ukraine saying at least give us a no-fly zone, which, essentially means U.S. fighter jets engaging the Russian Air Force. Your view on that is what? Should it be a hard no, or should that window be kept open if things get worse?
Well, I think Biden has made it a hard no. I don't see any change in that position. I don't think a no-fly zone is in prospect. But the question, in fairness, that you're asking is in move 21 in this chess game. What do I think when I don't like the last 15 moves, and to go back and recreate the policy I would have followed really takes much more than just putting up a no-fly zone. I don't see it realistic given where Biden is, however.
Okay, and you agree with that the U.S. shouldn't militarily engage in Ukraine regardless of the provocation?
Well, I think at least one thing that people could consider would be a no-fly zone over western Ukraine. The United Nations reports as of just a few minutes ago that there are about 1.3 million refugees having fled from Ukraine into neighboring countries. That number's only going to grow, and a no-fly zone in the West might bring some stability there that could minimize the hardship that these people are going to face. But as I say, I don't see any prospect Biden is going to authorize it.
Right.
I don't think it's going to happen.
Okay, interesting. A no-fly zone, at least in the western part of the country. Fascinating talking to you, Ambassador Bolton. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.